The windshield wipers struggled against the deluge as Stephanie killed the engine, her hands trembling more from exhaustion than fear now. The fuel gauge had been kissing empty for the last 20 miles, and her phone had lost signal somewhere near the state forest boundary. She'd been driving for 6 hours straight, taking every back road and forgotten highway she could find, but Marcus always seemed to know which way she'd turn. He'd proven that 3 times already in the past 2 months. The cabin squatted among the towering firs like something out of a fever dream, its cedar shingles dark with decades of rain and neglect. No vehicles in sight, no tire tracks in the muddy clearing, just the kind of forgotten hunting lodge that weekend warriors abandoned once the easy deer trails dried up. Perfect for someone who needed to disappear, at least until dawn. Stephanie grabbed the emergency bag from the passenger seat, the one she'd packed and repacked a dozen times in the employee locker room at Portland General. Spare clothes, protein bars, the cash she'd been skimming from grocery money for months, and the ultrasound photos she couldn't bring herself to leave behind. Everything she owned that mattered fit in a canvas tote bag that smelled like hospital disinfectant. The rain hit her like a physical blow as she hauled herself out of the Honda, her 8-month belly making every movement awkward and deliberate. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting this latest upheaval in their already chaotic existence. She pressed a hand to the spot and whispered, "I know, sweetheart. Mama's going to figure this out." The cabin's front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Stephanie hesitated at the threshold, her nurse's instincts cataloguing the dangers. Tetanus from rusty nails, mold spores, unstable floorboards, squatters with more to lose than she did. But Marcus was out there somewhere in his black pickup, probably calling his police buddies right now to help track down his mentally unstable ex-girlfriend, the same cops who'd smiled and nodded when she'd filed the restraining order, then suggested maybe she was overreacting to normal relationship stress. She pushed inside and fumbled for a light switch, finding nothing but empty wall. The air smelled of pine smoke and something else. Vanilla, maybe, or honey. Not the musty decay she'd expected. A soft flickering glow drew her deeper into the main room, where a fieldstone fireplace dominated one wall and rough-hewn furniture sat covered in dust sheets like sleeping ghosts. That's when she saw it. A single white candle burning on the mantelpiece, its flames steady and bright despite the drafts whistling through the cabin's gaps and cracks. The wax had pooled in perfect circles around the base, as if it had been burning for hours or days. But that was impossible. The cabin was clearly abandoned, probably had been for years. No electricity, no recent footprints in the dust, no signs that anyone had been here since the last hunting season. Stephanie moved closer, the baby shifting restlessly in her womb. The candle was nothing special, just plain white wax in a simple glass holder, the kind you could buy at any grocery store. But beside it, folded once and positioned with deliberate care, lay a piece of notebook paper that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Not her current script, the hurried scrawl of a busy nurse grabbing notes between emergencies, but the careful, looping penmanship Sister Margaret had drilled into her at St. Catherine's Academy 20 years ago. The exact formation of letters she'd abandoned after graduation, each I dotted with a tiny circle instead of a point, each G trailing into an elaborate flourish that had earned her gold stars in penmanship class. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper, already knowing that whatever was written there would change everything. The words seemed to pulse in the candlelight, each letter a small betrayal. The baby isn't his, and he knows. Stephanie's legs gave out, and she sank onto the dusty hearth, the note fluttering to the floor. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she wrapped both arms around her belly in a gesture that was part protection, part desperation. Because the note was right. Marcus wasn't the father, couldn't be the father, not with the timing, not with what had happened that night in April when she'd been working a double shift, and Dr. James Reeves had offered to drive her home through the spring storm. But she'd never told anyone, not her sister, not her best friend, not even herself in the dark hours when guilt and fear kept her awake. She'd buried that secret so deep she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't true. So how could she have written a note she didn't remember writing, in a place she'd never been, acknowledging a truth she'd never spoken aloud? Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, and somewhere in that sound, Stephanie could have sworn she heard the distant rumble of a diesel engine. The ordinary world. The rumble faded into the storm's chaos, leaving Stephanie to wonder if she'd imagined it. She forced herself to breathe, to think like the emergency room nurse she was, assess, prioritize, act. The note lay crumpled beside her on the hearth, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it again. Instead, she focused on the impossibilities stacking up like medical charts on a busy Friday night. 6 months ago, she told herself, this would have been impossible. 6 months ago, she'd had a life that made sense. Her studio apartment in southeast Portland, with its cheerful yellow walls and the herb garden on the fire escape. Her 7 to 7 shifts in the ER at Portland General, where she knew every doctor's coffee order and could start at 4 in the dark. Tuesday night dinners with her sister Amy, who'd roll her eyes and say Marcus was too controlling but never push hard enough to make Stephanie defensive. Her routine morning jogs through Laurelhurst Park before the nausea hit, back when she could still pretend the pregnancy was planned, wanted, normal. She'd built that ordinary life, piece by piece, after aging out of foster care, every small stability a victory against the chaos of her childhood. The steady paycheck, the apartment lease in her own name, the nursing degree she'd earned working nights and weekends while her classmates partied. It hadn't been glamorous, but it had been hers. Safe and predictable in a way her childhood never was. Then Marcus had started showing up at the hospital during her breaks, claiming he just wanted to bring her lunch. Sweet at first, until she realized he was timing her movements, checking her mileage, going through her phone while she slept. The pregnancy had made it worse. Suddenly every decision was about their baby, every choice required his approval. When she'd finally worked up the courage to leave 2 months ago, he'd found her within hours at Amy's house. "You can't hide from me, Steph," he'd said through Amy's door, his voice carrying that dangerous calm that meant his hands were already clenched into fists. "That baby is mine, and so are you." But the baby wasn't his, and somehow he'd figured it out. The dates didn't quite add up if you paid attention, and Marcus always paid attention. She'd seen him studying the ultrasound photos with the same intensity he brought to examining her phone records, counting backward from the due date with growing suspicion. The truth was simpler and more complicated than he could imagine. Dr. James Reeves, with his salt and pepper beard and wedding ring that caught the fluorescent lights when he sutured lacerations. She'd been working a double shift that night in April, dead on her feet after 18 hours of drug overdoses and domestic violence calls. The spring storm had knocked out power in half the city, and when her Honda wouldn't start in the flooded parking garage, James had insisted on driving her home. "It's on my way," he'd lied, because his house in the West Hills was nowhere near her apartment. They'd sat in his BMW in her parking lot, rain drumming on the roof, talking about the teenage overdose they'd lost that shift. She'd been crying, something she never did at work, and he'd reached over to touch her face. Just comfort at first, the kind of gentle touch she'd forgotten existed. Then his thumb had traced her lower lip, and she'd leaned into his palm like a flower turning toward sunlight. It happened in her apartment, on the couch she'd bought second-hand from a retiring nurse. Gentle and desperate and completely wrong because he was married and she was dating Marcus, and they both knew better. Afterward, James had held her while she cried again, this time from guilt instead of exhaustion. "This can't happen again," he'd whispered into her hair. "I know," she'd whispered back. And it hadn't. They'd worked together professionally for months afterward, never mentioning that night, never acknowledging the way her breath caught when he passed behind her at the nurse's station. When she'd realized she was pregnant 6 weeks later, she'd done the math and felt her world tilt sideways. But Marcus had been so happy, so convinced the baby was his gift to the world, that she'd let him believe it. It seemed kinder than the truth. Now, sitting in an impossible cabin, with an impossible note written in her own impossible handwriting. Stephanie wondered if kindness had been the wrong choice, if secrets had their own gravity, pulling truth toward them until reality bent under the weight. The baby kicked again, and she found herself thinking about everything she was about to lose. Her job, because missing 3 consecutive shifts meant automatic termination, union or not. Her apartment, because the rent was due in 2 days and her checking account held maybe enough for gas money. Her sister's fragile trust, because Amy had warned her about Marcus from the beginning, and being right about him wouldn't make watching Stephanie's life implode any easier. But mostly, she was terrified of losing the one thing that had never been hers to begin with. The fantasy that this baby could have a normal life, a stable home, parents who loved each other instead of 2 people bound together by a lie. Thunder crashed overhead, and this time there was no mistaking the sound underneath it. Diesel engine getting closer. Stephanie's heart hammered against her ribs as she struggled to her feet, one hand braced against the mantelpiece for support. The diesel engine's rumble grew distinct from the storm's cacophony, a deep, aggressive growl she recognized with sickening certainty. Marcus's modified F-350, the one he'd spent weekends tuning until it announced his presence from 3 blocks away. He'd found her again, just like he always did. The candle flame flickered as she moved, casting wild shadows across the cabin's walls. She grabbed the note from the floor, her childhood handwriting seeming to pulse in the uncertain light. The baby isn't his, and he knows. The words felt like a prophecy now, a warning she'd somehow given herself about this exact moment. Outside, the engine cut off, car door slammed. Heavy boots splashed through puddles, each step deliberate and measured, the walk of a man who knew his prey was trapped. Stephanie's mind raced through options with the cold efficiency she'd learned in the ER. The cabin's back door was boarded shut, and the windows were too small for someone 8 months pregnant. The front door was the only way out, and Marcus would be coming through it any second. She could hide under the dust-covered furniture behind the fireplace, but her breathing was too loud, too panicked, and the baby kept shifting restlessly, as if sensing her terror. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. "I know you're in there, Steph." His voice carried that false gentleness she'd once mistaken for tenderness. "Your car's right here. Engine's still warm. We need to talk." She pressed herself against the stone fireplace, the note clutched in her trembling fingers. The candle continued burning steadily, impossibly, as if it existed outside the normal rules that governed fire and wind, just like the note existed outside everything she understood about time and memory. "I'm not angry," Marcus continued, his tone reasonable, patient. The same voice he used when explaining why she needed to quit working night shifts, why her friends were bad influences, why loving someone meant never questioning their decisions. "I know you're scared about the baby. First-time mothers always panic. But running away isn't the answer." The baby kicked hard, and Stephanie bit back a gasp. She found herself staring at the note again, at handwriting that belonged to her but felt like it came from someone else entirely, someone who'd known this moment would come, who'd tried to warn her across impossible distances of time and space. "The door's unlocked, sweetheart. I'm coming in." The hinges creaked. Heavy boots crossed the threshold, and Stephanie heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath as he spotted the candle's glow. She closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable confrontation, the careful words that would escalate, to shouting and then to worse things. The cycle that had driven her to this abandoned cabin in the first place. But instead of anger, she heard something that chilled her more than any threat: confusion. "What the hell?" Marcus's voice carried a note of genuine bewilderment. "Steph, who lit that candle?" Her eyes snapped open. She could see his silhouette in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, water streaming from his rain jacket. But he wasn't looking at her hiding spot behind the fireplace. He was staring at the candle with an expression she'd never seen before, not anger or calculation, but something closer to fear. "There's no one here but us," he said, more to himself than to her. "Place has been empty for years, so who—" His gaze dropped to the floor near the hearth, and Stephanie realized with horror that she'd left footprints in the dust. a clear trail leading from the door to where she crouched behind the stone chimney. But Marcus wasn't following the trail. He was staring at something else entirely. Other footprints, she realized, smaller ones, leading to the mantelpiece and back, forming a pattern that suggested someone had placed the candle there recently. Someone who wasn't her. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and the movement knocked her off balance. She grabbed instinctively for support, and her knuckles scraped against stone. The tiny sound echoed in the silence like a gunshot. Marcus spun toward her hiding spot, his face shifting from confusion to that familiar mask of controlled fury. "There you are." But his voice still carried that undertone of unease, as if the mysterious candle had shaken something loose in his usual certainty. Stephanie clutched the note tighter, feeling the paper's edges bite into her palm. In that moment, with Marcus bearing down on her and the impossible candle casting everything in surreal light, she faced a choice that felt larger than simply deciding whether to run or fight. She could try to explain the note, the handwriting, the burning candle that shouldn't exist. She could attempt to make Marcus understand that something beyond normal reality was happening in this cabin, or she could do what she'd always done, make herself smaller, quieter, more manageable. Submit to his version of truth and let him drag her back to the life that was slowly strangling them both. The candle flame steadied, and for one impossible moment, Stephanie could have sworn she smelled vanilla and honey mixed with something else, the faint scent of her childhood bedroom at St. Catherine's, where she'd practiced her careful penmanship by candlelight after lights out. The scent of St. Catherine's, vanilla candles, and honey from the kitchen, mixed with the musty smell of old textbooks, crashed over Stephanie like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, she wasn't 8 months pregnant and trapped in an abandoned cabin. She was 12 years old again, hunched over her composition notebook in the dormitory after Sister Margaret's lights-out bell, practicing her penmanship by forbidden candlelight because perfect handwriting was the only thing that earned praise in that cold, institutional world. Stephanie. Marcus's voice cut through the memory, gentle but edged with steel. "Come out where I can see you." She pressed deeper against the stone fireplace, the note crumpling in her sweating palm. Every instinct screamed at her to comply, to emerge with downcast eyes and apologetic words. "I'm sorry. I was scared. I wasn't thinking clearly. The pregnancy hormones made me irrational." The familiar script of submission she'd perfected over 2 years with Marcus. The same way she'd perfected her penmanship at St. Catherine's. Through repetition, fear, and the desperate hope that being good enough might finally make someone love her. But the baby shifted inside her, pressing against her ribs with what felt like urgency, and she found herself thinking about Dr. Reeves instead. James, with his careful hands and kind eyes, who'd never once raised his voice to her in all their years working together, who'd held her that night in April like she was something precious instead of something to be managed and controlled. The baby isn't his, and he knows. The words on the note seemed to pulse in her memory, each letter as familiar as her own reflection. But how could she have written something she'd never acknowledged, even to herself? How could her 12-year-old handwriting appear in a place she'd never been, warning her about a truth she'd spent months denying? "I can smell your perfume," Marcus said, moving closer. "That cheap stuff from the drugstore, you know I hate it." She'd stopped wearing perfume months ago because he hated it, stopped wearing makeup because he said it made her look desperate for male attention, stopped working double shifts because he needed her home. One by one, she'd let him strip away pieces of herself until she barely recognized the woman staring back from mirrors. But she wasn't wearing perfume now, just the vanilla and honey scent that shouldn't exist, carrying memories of a lonely child who'd found solace in stolen moments of candlelight and careful letters. A child who'd believed that if she could just be perfect enough, quiet enough, good enough, someone would finally want to keep her. "We both know you're not thinking clearly," Marcus continued, his boots crunching through debris as he searched the cabin. "Pregnancy brain, that's all this is. You're scared about becoming a mother, so you're acting out. It's normal." Normal. He made everything sound so reasonable when he said it that way. Her fears were normal. Her desire for independence was normal pregnancy anxiety. Her growing certainty that she was trapped was just hormonal confusion that would resolve itself once the baby came and she could think clearly again. Except she'd never thought more clearly than she did right now, crouched behind a fireplace with a note written in her own impossible handwriting. The clarity was terrifying, not the soft, manageable fear of Marcus's anger, but the sharp-edged terror of glimpsing something vast and incomprehensible, something that suggested her carefully constructed understanding of reality was as fragile as the paper trembling in her hands. The baby kicked again, and this time she felt it differently, not as protest or discomfort, but as communication, a reminder that this wasn't just about her anymore. Whatever was happening in this cabin, whatever impossible forces had brought her here and lit that candle and written that note, she had someone else to protect now. Someone who deserved better than a mother who'd learned to make herself small and a father who wasn't really a father at all. "Found your hiding spot," Marcus said, triumph warming his voice. "Behind the fireplace, right? You always did think you were cleverer than you actually are." Her breath caught. He was close now. Close enough that she could hear the satisfied smile in his words, the particular tone he used when he'd caught her in what he considered a lie. In a moment he'd round the corner and find her crouched there like a guilty child, and then the familiar dance would begin. His disappointed lectures about her selfishness, her inability to think rationally, her need for his guidance and protection. But as his shadow fell across the floor near her feet, Stephanie found herself staring at the candle's steady flame and thinking about choices. Not the big dramatic ones that changed everything in an instant, but the small daily decisions that accumulated like snowflakes until they became an avalanche. The choice to speak or stay silent, to believe his version of reality or trust her own perceptions, to protect the lie that held her old life together or embrace a truth so impossible it might destroy everything she thought she knew. The vanilla and honey scent grew stronger, and somewhere in its sweetness she caught another familiar smell, the faint metallic tang of hospital disinfectant that clung to her scrubs, her skin, her identity as someone who healed instead of being broken. The hospital scent crystallized something inside her, sharp and clean as surgical steel. She wasn't just the terrified girl from St. Catherine's or Marcus's diminished girlfriend. She was Stephanie Chen, emergency room nurse, someone who made life and death decisions every day, someone who'd held dying strangers' hands and talked teenagers through overdoses and never once backed down from blood or chaos or impossible odds. Marcus's shadow stretched closer, but instead of shrinking away, Stephanie found herself standing. The movement was slow, deliberate, her hand still clutching the note as she rose from behind the fireplace, like something emerging from the earth itself. "There you are," Marcus said, but his voice carried less satisfaction than she'd expected. The candle's flickering light caught his face, revealing something she'd never seen there before. Uncertainty. "Jesus, Steph, you look like you've seen a ghost." Maybe she had. Maybe she was one. "How did you find me?" Her voice came out steady, stronger than she felt. "Find you?" Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. "I followed your car, obviously, though I have to say this is a new level of dramatic, even for you, running off to some haunted cabin in the middle of nowhere." His gaze flicked to the burning candle, and that uncertainty flickered across his features again. "Who else is here?" "No one." She opened her palm, revealing the crumpled note. The words seemed to glow in the candlelight. "The baby isn't his, and he knows. Just me and this." Marcus stepped closer, squinting at the paper. "What is that?" For one crystalline moment, Stephanie balanced on the knife's edge between her old life and whatever lay beyond it. She could crumple the note completely, toss it into the fireplace, watch it burn, tell Marcus she'd panicked about becoming a mother, that she was sorry, that she'd come home now and be good. Return to their apartment, and their careful routines, and the slow suffocation she'd mistaken for love, the safe choice, the small choice. Instead, she held out the note. "Read it." Marcus took the paper, his brow furrowing as his eyes tracked across the words. She watched his face change, confusion giving way to recognition, recognition hardening into something cold and dangerous. "This is your handwriting," he said slowly. "Yes, but you didn't write this." "No." He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the moment he stopped trying to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. "The baby isn't his," Marcus read aloud, his voice deadly quiet. "And he knows." The baby kicked hard, as if responding to the words, and Stephanie's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The gesture wasn't lost on Marcus. She saw his gaze track the movement, saw him remember all those nights when he'd studied her ultrasound photos with growing suspicion. "April," he said, "you worked that double shift, the night of the storm. Your car wouldn't start. Marcus, Dr. Reeves drove you home." Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would reach every corner of their shared life. Married Dr. Reeves, with his fancy car and his gentle bedside manner. The candle flame jumped higher, casting wild shadows across the cabin walls. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, but it sounded different now, less like a storm and more like something vast stirring to wakefulness. "I loved you," Marcus said, and for the first time in months, his voice carried genuine emotion instead of calculated control. "I would have raised his baby as my own. I would have forgiven you. I know. But you lied to me. You let me believe—" He stopped, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "How long have you known?" The truth hung between them, like smoke from the impossible candle. Stephanie thought about all the nights she'd lain awake, doing math, counting weeks, remembering the gentle weight of James's hands and the way he'd whispered her name like a prayer. About the morning sickness that had felt like guilt, and the way her heart had seized every time Marcus talked about their baby. "Since the beginning," she said. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not just anger, but a kind of bewildered hurt that made him look younger, more vulnerable. The man she'd once thought she could save from his own darkness. "Then why didn't you just leave?" he asked. "Why put us both through this?" Before she could answer, the candle flame suddenly blazed brighter, filling the cabin with vanilla-scented light. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against her skin like a living thing, and in that impossible brightness, Stephanie saw something that made her blood freeze. More footprints in the dust. Small ones, child-sized, leading from the door to the mantelpiece in a pattern that spelled out a single word in careful, familiar script. "Run." Stephanie stared at the word spelled out in dusty footprints, her heart hammering against her ribs. The prints were too small to belong to any adult, formed by bare feet that had pressed deliberate patterns into the cabin floor, patterns that looked disturbingly like her own careful penmanship from childhood. Marcus followed her gaze and stumbled backward, his face draining of color. "What the hell is this place?" Before she could answer, new sounds drifted through the storm, car doors slamming, voices calling through the rain. Marcus spun toward the door, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket where he kept his phone. "You called someone," Stephanie said, the realization hitting her like ice water. "I called my brother and Jake from work. Told them you might be having some kind of breakdown." Marcus's voice carried defensive pride, as if summoning reinforcements was reasonable preparation. "Pregnant women can be dangerous to themselves, Steph. Everyone knows that." The footprints in the dust seemed to shimmer in the candlelight, and Stephanie caught a whiff of something new beneath the vanilla and honey, the antiseptic smell of a hospital mixed with something older, earthier, like sage and copper pennies. "Stephanie?" a voice called from outside, male, unfamiliar. "My name is Detective Morrison. Your boyfriend is worried about you. Can we talk?" Not boyfriend, she thought wildly. Not anymore. The candle flame stretched impossibly tall, and in its light she saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about reality. Standing in the corner, near the boarded window, was a figure, translucent, wavering, but unmistakably there. A young girl with dark hair and careful posture, wearing the grey uniform of St. Catherine's Home for Girls. The girl was herself, not as she remembered being, but as she'd actually looked at 12, smaller, sharper-edged, with eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. The girl raised one finger to her lips in a gesture for silence, then pointed toward the back of the cabin, where shadows pooled like black water. "There's a cellar," the girl who was herself mouthed silently. "Behind the woodpile." Marcus was backing toward the door, his confident facade cracking. "I don't know what kind of trick this is, but it's not funny anymore. Those footprints weren't here when I came in. And that candle," he gestured wildly. "Candles don't burn for hours without melting. Someone's messing with us." "Stephanie?" The detective's voice again, closer now. "We just want to make sure you're safe. You and the baby." The ghostly 12-year-old shook her head urgently, pointing again toward the shadows, and suddenly Stephanie understood with crystalline clarity that whatever forces had brought her to this cabin, whatever impossible circumstances had conjured that note and lit that candle, they weren't finished with her yet. The men outside represented everything she was running from: control disguised as protection, authority wielded by people who saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a person making choices. But the girl in the corner represented something else entirely. The part of herself that had survived St. Catherine's cold dormitories and Sister Margaret's harsh lessons, the part that had learned to make herself small not from weakness, but from strategy, the part that knew how to endure until endurance became strength. The baby kicked hard, and this time Stephanie felt it like a message: choose. "Marcus," she said quietly, backing toward the woodpile, "do you love me, or do you love controlling me?" He stopped, edging toward the door, his face twisting with frustration. "That's not fair. Everything I do is to protect you. You're carrying my child." "No," she said, her voice carrying the authority she used when coding patients in the ER. "I'm not." The truth hung between them like a blade, sharp enough to cut through 2 years of careful lies and desperate compromises. Marcus's face went through a series of transformations: hurt, rage, something that might have been relief. "Then what are we even doing here?" he asked, and for the first time since she'd known him, he sounded genuinely lost. Before she could answer, heavy footsteps approached the cabin door, multiple sets of boots, moving with the careful coordination of men who'd done this before. The detective's voice carried new authority. "We're coming in, Stephanie. Nice and easy." The ghostly girl gestured frantically toward the woodpile, her form flickering like a candle in wind. In the growing light, too bright now, impossible bright, Stephanie could see what she'd missed before: loose floorboards behind the stacked wood, forming a trapdoor that led down into darkness. The candle flame reached toward the ceiling like a beacon, and somewhere in its vanilla-scented warmth, Stephanie heard an echo of her own voice from years ago, practicing the careful words she'd written in composition notebooks by forbidden light. "I will be good enough. I will be perfect enough. Someone will want me." Now, 8 months pregnant and facing the wreckage of everything she'd built, she realized those words had been both prophecy and curse. She had made herself perfect enough, for the wrong people, for the wrong reasons, in all the wrong ways. The door rattled as someone tested the handle, and Stephanie Chen made the choice that would define everything that came after. She ran toward the darkness below. The trapdoor's wooden rungs felt solid beneath her hands, despite their obvious age. Each step down into the darkness a deliberate rejection of the chaos erupting above. Behind her, the cabin door burst open with a crash that sent vibrations through the floorboards overhead, followed by Marcus's voice rising in explanation and justification. The familiar cadence of a man who believed his version of reality was the only one that mattered. "She's not thinking clearly," he was saying, his words muffled by the wooden planks between them. 8 months pregnant, probably postpartum depression setting in early. "I've been trying to get her to see someone, but you know how stubborn women can be about admitting they need help." The basement was impossibly vast for a hunting cabin, stretching beyond what the structure above should have been able to contain. Ancient stone walls extended into shadows that seemed to swallow her phone's flashlight beam. and the air carried that same vanilla and honey scent mixed with something earthier, old paper and dried herbs, like a library that had been abandoned to the forest. Heavy footsteps moved overhead as the detective and his companions searched the main room. Stephanie pressed herself against the stone wall, one hand on her belly where the baby had gone unnaturally still, as if even her unborn child understood the need for absolute quiet. "Loose floorboards here," a voice called out. Not Marcus, someone older, more authoritative. Behind the woodpile, looks like they've been disturbed recently. They know about the trapdoor. Stephanie moved deeper into the basement, her flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed carved from living rock rather than built. Symbols were etched into the stone, not random scratches, but deliberate markings that hurt to look at directly, as if they were meant to be felt rather than seen. A ghostly 12-year-old materialized beside her, more solid now in the darkness below ground. The girl's St. Catherine's uniform was crisp and neat, her hair braided with the same obsessive precision Stephanie remembered practicing for hours in the dormitory mirror. But her eyes held knowledge that no 12-year-old should possess. "They won't follow us down here," the girl said, her voice carrying the careful diction Sister Margaret had drilled into all her charges. "This place doesn't like men who think they own things that were never theirs to begin with." Above them, boards creaked ominously. Someone was testing the trapdoor's edges, probing for weaknesses. Stephanie heard Marcus's voice again, closer now. "She's down there somewhere. Probably hurt herself climbing down in the dark." Stephanie was always reckless when she got emotional. The casual dismissal in his tone, the way he reduced her desperate escape to female hysteria, crystallized. Something cold and sharp in her chest. How many times had he explained away her feelings like that? How many moments of legitimate anger or fear had he transformed into evidence of her inherent instability? "This basement," she whispered to her younger self. "It's impossible. The cabin isn't big enough." The girl smiled with sad wisdom. "Nothing about this place follows normal rules. It responds to need, to the kind of desperation that carves new possibilities out of solid rock." She gestured toward the symbols on the walls. "These have been here longer than the cabin, longer than the trees outside. Women have been leaving marks here for generations, trying to find their way back to themselves." The flashlight beam caught something metallic embedded in the far wall, not symbols this time, but objects. Stephanie moved closer, and her breath caught. They were rings, wedding bands and engagement rings, dozens of them, pressed into the stone like offerings. Each one seemed to pulse with its own dim light, creating a constellation of abandoned promises. "The women who came before," the ghostly girl explained. "They left pieces of their old lives here before they could build new ones. The stone remembers." Above them, the trapdoor groaned under someone's weight. A thin beam of candlelight penetrated the darkness as boots appeared on the ladder's top rungs. "Stephanie!" The detective's voice carried forced patience. "We're coming down. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But as the first boot touched the ladder's second rung, something extraordinary happened. The stone walls began to hum, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from deep in the earth itself. The symbols glowed brighter, pulsing in rhythm with Stephanie's heartbeat, and the vanilla scent grew so strong it became almost visible, swirling through the air like incense. The detective's boot slipped. He cursed, tried again, but each time he attempted to descend, the ladder seemed to shift slightly, the rungs becoming unreliable under his weight. "It's protecting you," the girl said simply, "the way it protected all of us. But you have to choose what comes next. You can hide down here forever, or you can use what this place is offering to become something new." The baby stirred, a gentle flutter that felt like agreement. Stephanie pressed her palm against the wall beside the constellation of abandoned rings, and in that touch she felt the accumulated strength of every woman who had ever stood in this impossible space, and decided that survival wasn't enough, that she deserved to live freely, not just safely. The choice was no longer about escaping Marcus or the detective above. It was about deciding who she wanted to become. The stone wall pulsed beneath Stephanie's palm like a heartbeat, and suddenly she understood what the girl meant about choosing. The rings embedded in the rock weren't just abandoned, they were transformed, their gold and silver bands becoming part of something larger, more enduring. The women who'd come before hadn't simply escaped their old lives, they'd alchemized them into power. "What happens if I touch one?" Stephanie whispered. "You remember," the girl said. "Everything they experienced, everything they learned. But once you know what they knew, you can never unknow it." Above, the detective was swearing creatively as the ladder continued to shift beneath his weight. Marcus's voice carried new desperation. "Just let me go down. She trusts me. I can talk her up." The bitter irony might have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. Marcus, who had spent 2 years systematically eroding her confidence, now positioning himself as her savior, the man who'd convinced her that her nursing instincts were wrong, that her desire for independence was selfishness, that her fear of his temper was oversensitivity. The baby kicked suddenly, not the gentle flutter from before, but a sharp, urgent movement that made her gasp. In that moment of connection with the life growing inside her, Stephanie felt something shift in the stone wall. The symbols began to glow brighter, and the rings pulsed in sympathetic rhythm. "She's choosing," the ghostly girl whispered, her form becoming more solid. "Your daughter. She's choosing too." Daughter. The word hit her like a physical blow. She deliberately avoided learning the baby's sex, terrified that knowing would make everything more real, more complicated. But of course it was a girl. Of course she was carrying a daughter into this mess of lies and half-truths, and men who thought they owned pieces of her. "What will she face?" Stephanie asked, her palm still pressed against the stone. "If I go back up there, if I let them take me home, what kind of life will she have?" The girl's expression grew grave. "The same one you had, the same one I had, always apologizing for taking up space, always grateful for the smallest kindness, always wondering if love is supposed to feel like walking on glass." From above came the sound of splintering wood. The detective had apparently decided to tear the trapdoor apart rather than risk the ladder. Heavy fragments crashed to the basement floor, and harsh artificial light from their flashlights cut through the gentle glow of the symbols. "Time's up," the girl said urgently. "Touch one of the rings. Let them show you what courage actually looks like." Stephanie's fingers found the nearest ring, a simple gold band that felt warm despite being embedded in cold stone. The moment her skin made contact, the world exploded into visions. She was Mary Elizabeth Thornton, 1943, fleeing to the mountains with her daughter after her husband returned from the war, violent and strange. She was Rosa Martinez, 1967, 8 months pregnant and discovering the cabin after her boyfriend tried to push her down the stairs. She was Jennifer Walsh, 1994, running from a family that wanted to institutionalize her for refusing to marry the man who'd assaulted her. Dozens of women, different eras, same desperate flight towards something that felt like freedom. But in each vision, Stephanie saw the moment of choice, the moment when survival wasn't enough anymore, when they'd reached for something larger than mere escape. They'd reached for transformation. The knowledge flooded through her like ice water, carrying with it skills she'd never learned, strength she'd never known she possessed. Her ER training had taught her to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, but this was different. This was the accumulated wisdom of women who'd faced impossible odds and chosen to become impossible themselves. Heavy boots thudded onto the basement floor as the detective and another man descended through the destroyed trapdoor. Their flashlights swept the space, searching for her in the shadows where normal physics said she should be cornered. But the basement had changed. The walls stretched beyond their light now, creating passages that led deeper into the mountain, into spaces that shouldn't exist. The stone hummed with protective energy, and the air itself seemed to bend light away from where she stood. "Stephanie Chen," the detective called, his voice echoing strangely off the impossible walls. "You're not in trouble. We're here to help." The words might have been convincing if she hadn't spent her childhood hearing similar promises from social workers and administrators who'd helped her right into situations that benefited everyone except her. If she hadn't spent 2 years hearing Marcus's version of help, which always somehow required her to become smaller, quieter, more grateful. The baby, her daughter, kicked again, and this time Stephanie felt it as encouragement, as partnership. She wasn't just choosing for herself anymore, she was choosing for both of them. The ring grew warm beneath her palm, and Stephanie Chen made her decision. She pressed deeper into the stone, letting the accumulated power of generations flow through her, and spoke a single word that seemed to reshape the very air. No. The word hung in the impossible air for exactly 3 heartbeats before everything went catastrophically wrong. The stone beneath Stephanie's palm cracked with a sound like breaking bones, and the warm pulse of accumulated power suddenly turned cold, then disappeared entirely. The ring she'd touched, Mary Elizabeth's simple gold band, crumbled to dust, and with it went all the borrowed strength, all the inherited courage that had been flowing through her moments before. "There," Marcus's voice cut through the darkness, triumphant and sharp. "I can see her light." The basement snapped back to its original dimensions with nauseating speed, the impossible passages collapsing like punctured lungs. The symbols on the walls flickered once, then went dark, leaving only ordinary stone that offered no protection, no sanctuary. The vanilla and honey scent vanished, replaced by the musty smell of old earth and her own fear sweat. The ghostly 12-year-old flickered like a dying television, her form becoming transparent. "The baby," she whispered urgently, her voice already fading. "Something's wrong with—" But before she could finish, the girl dissolved completely, leaving Stephanie alone in a basement that was suddenly brutally normal. Just rough stone walls and wooden support beams, and 2 men with flashlights closing in on her position. That's when the pain hit. It started low in her back, a grinding pressure that made her gasp and stumble away from the now cold wall. The baby, who had been kicking with such fierce determination moments before, went completely still. Not the purposeful stillness of earlier, but something else entirely, an absence that made Stephanie's blood turn to ice. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing both hands to her belly. But there was no responding movement, no flutter of acknowledgement, just terrifying silence where her daughter's presence should be. The detective's flashlight beam found her then, pinning her against the wall like a specimen. "There you are. It's okay, Stephanie. Let's get you somewhere safe." But it wasn't okay, and she wasn't safe. And something was going horribly wrong with the pregnancy. She could feel it, a loosening, a sense of her body betraying the life it was supposed to protect, the stress, the running, the supernatural encounter that had pushed her system beyond its limits. "I need a hospital," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong with the baby." Marcus was beside her instantly, his hands reaching for her arms with practiced possessiveness. "Of course something's wrong. Look what you've done to yourself, hiding down here like some kind of animal. This is exactly why you need supervision." Even in her panic, even with everything falling apart, the casual cruelty of his words hit like a physical blow. A medical emergency was already being transformed into evidence of her inherent inadequacy, her desperate flight reframed as proof she couldn't be trusted with her own decisions. "Don't touch me," she said, trying to pull away, but her legs weren't working properly. The pain in her back had spread to her abdomen, and she could feel wetness between her thighs that might be blood. The detective stepped forward, professional concern masking something harder. "Ma'am, we need to get you to a medical facility, but first we have some questions about your relationship with Dr. Marcus Chen and the circumstances that brought you here." Dr. Marcus Chen. The formal introduction sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. Marcus wasn't just her abusive ex-boyfriend here. He was someone official enough to warrant police involvement. Someone with credentials and authority that would outweigh her word in any official report. "Questions can wait," Marcus said smoothly. slipping into his professional persona like armor. As her physician, I'm concerned about potential pregnancy complications brought on by extreme stress and irrational behavior. As her physician, not as the man who'd thrown a glass at her head 3 days ago, not as the person she'd been fleeing when she found the cabin. He was already constructing the narrative that would follow her to the hospital into whatever came next. The baby still hadn't moved. Stephanie's legs gave out completely then, sending her sliding down the stone wall to the basement floor. The wetness between her thighs was definitely blood now, and the pain had transformed into something systematic, purposeful, her body's way of ending what it could no longer sustain. Placental abruption, she whispered, her nursing training providing the clinical term even as her heart broke. I'm losing her. Marcus was already taking charge, barking orders to the detective about calling an ambulance, about clearing a path to the cabin entrance. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in medical emergencies, and Stephanie realized with crystalline horror that she was about to become his patient again, dependent on his expertise, grateful for his intervention. The rings in the wall had all gone dark, their power exhausted or withdrawn. The women who'd come before had found transformation in this place, but Stephanie was going to lose everything. Her daughter, her freedom, her carefully constructed escape. She'd said no, but the world had said no back, and the world was winning. The baby moved. Not the gentle flutter Stephanie had felt before, but something else entirely, a rolling, purposeful shift that defied everything she knew about placental abruption. The wetness between her thighs wasn't blood after all, she realized with startling clarity. Her water had broken. She's not dying, Stephanie whispered, pressing her palm against her belly. She's being born. Marcus paused mid-sentence in his instructions to the detective, his flashlight beam swinging back to her. That's impossible. You're 8 months along, and the symptoms clearly indicate— I'm a nurse, Stephanie cut him off, her voice gaining strength as understanding flooded through her. I know what I'm feeling. This isn't abruption, it's labor. But even as she spoke, she knew it was more than that. The baby's movement felt different, not distressed but determined, purposeful, as if her daughter was choosing this moment, this place, despite the impossible timing. The detective stepped closer, his radio crackling with static. Ma'am, we still need to get you medical attention. Even if it's labor, you're in the middle of nowhere with complications. No complications. The voice that spoke wasn't quite Stephanie's. It carried the same careful diction her 12-year-old self had used, but layered with something deeper, ancient. The birth will be safe here. This place has delivered many daughters. Marcus's flashlight beam swept the walls, and Stephanie saw his face change as the symbols became visible again, glowing softly in response to the baby's movement. The rings embedded in the stone pulsed with renewed light, and the vanilla and honey scent returned, so strong it made the air shimmer. What the hell? The detective started, but his words cut off as his radio died completely, the static fading to silence. The cabin doesn't want interference, Stephanie said, and she knew it was true even as she spoke. It never did. That's why you couldn't find it until now. Why the GPS failed, why everything that brought me here felt like destiny instead of coincidence. Another contraction gripped her, but instead of pain, she felt power. The stone wall behind her grew warm, supporting her weight, and she realized that the rings weren't just embedded in the rock, they were roots of something larger, a network that connected this place to women across generations. Women who had chosen transformation over submission, daughters over dependence. Marcus stepped forward, his professional mask slipping. Stephanie, you're having some kind of psychotic break. The stress, the pregnancy hormones, you're seeing things that aren't there. But the detective was backing toward the ladder, his face pale in the growing light from the symbols. Sir, I think we should call for backup, medical backup, and maybe someone who understands this kind of situation. What kind of situation? Marcus demanded. She's a pregnant woman having a breakdown, not some kind of supernatural. He stopped mid-sentence as Stephanie rose to her feet, the stone wall somehow supporting her despite her water breaking. despite the impossibility of what was happening. The baby kicked once, a greeting that felt like recognition, and suddenly Stephanie understood what the ghostly girl had been trying to tell her. The women who came before hadn't just found sanctuary in this place. They'd found the power to rewrite the rules that bound them, to birth daughters who would grow up free from the patterns that had trapped their mothers. "My daughter won't need to run," Stephanie said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "She won't spend her life apologizing for existing, or grateful for scraps of kindness, or afraid that love comes with conditions. Because I'm choosing something different for both of us." The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, and Stephanie felt the accumulated strength of generations flowing back through her, not borrowed this time, but inherited, claimed. The knowledge that had briefly touched her through Mary Elizabeth's ring returned, but now it belonged to her completely. Marcus made a desperate grab for her arm, his fingers closing around her wrist with familiar bruising pressure. "You're my wife," he hissed, dropping all pretense. "The baby is mine. You don't get to decide anything without my permission." The moment his skin touched hers, everything crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. He wasn't her husband, had never been her husband. The ring she'd worn, the life she'd built with him, all of it had been constructed from lies so complete she'd forgotten they weren't real. The detective wasn't here to help. He was here because Marcus had reported her missing property that needed to be returned to its rightful owner. But the baby growing inside her, her daughter, she was real. And she was the key to breaking every chain that had ever bound Stephanie to a life that felt like drowning. "No," Stephanie said again. But this time the word didn't hang in the air. It sank into the stone, into the rings, into the very foundation of the impossible cabin. This time the word became truth. The moment Stephanie's nose sank into the cabin's foundation, Marcus's grip on her wrist simply dissolved. Not broken or pulled away, his fingers passed through her skin like she was made of morning mist. He stumbled backward, staring at his hand with the bewildered expression of a man whose fundamental understanding of reality had just shattered. "What did you do?" he whispered, but his voice carried no authority now, only confusion and the first edge of fear. The detective had already reached the ladder, his radio dead in his hands, his flashlight flickering as the symbols on the walls grew brighter. "Ma'am," he called down, his professional composure cracking, "we need to discuss this situation rationally." But Stephanie wasn't listening to either of them anymore. The strength flowing through her from generations of women felt different now, not borrowed courage or inherited power, but something that belonged to her completely. She pressed her palm against the stone wall and felt the accumulated wisdom of every woman who had ever chosen transformation over surrender. "You were never as powerless as they convinced you to believe," whispered a voice that might have been the ghostly girl, or Mary Elizabeth, or her own forgotten 12-year-old self. The chains were always made of lies. Another contraction gripped her, but this time she welcomed it. Her daughter was coming, and the cabin was preparing to receive her. The vanilla and honey scent grew stronger, joined by something else, the clean smell of snow and pine that spoke of new beginnings. The stone beneath her palm grew warm, reshaping itself to support her weight as she settled into a more comfortable position. "Listen to me," Marcus said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd always used when she questioned his version of events. "You're having pregnancy-induced psychosis. The hallucinations, the paranoid delusions about our relationship, these are symptoms, not reality." For a moment, the familiar words almost worked. 2 years of conditioning whispered that maybe he was right, maybe she really was losing her mind, maybe the rings and symbols and impossible geography of the cabin were just her brain's way of processing a complete psychological break. Then her daughter kicked, a firm reminder of what was real, and the doubt vanished like smoke. "You're not my doctor," Stephanie said quietly, her voice carrying across the basement with perfect clarity. "You never were my husband, and you have no claim on my daughter." She looked directly at the detective, who was still clinging to the ladder like a lifeline. "Officer, I need you to listen very carefully. This man has been holding me against my will for months. The pregnancy, the relationship he's describing, none of it happened the way he's telling you." The detective's face went pale. "Ma'am, if you're alleging kidnapping, we need to follow proper procedures." "There won't be any procedures," Marcus interrupted, his mask finally slipping completely. "Because no one is going to believe a hysterical pregnant woman over a licensed physician with a spotless reputation, especially not when she's having her breakdown in some impossible cabin that shouldn't exist." The casual cruelty in his voice, the absolute confidence that his word would always outweigh hers, it should have terrified her. Instead, Stephanie felt something settle into place, like a puzzle piece finding its home. "You're right," she said, rising to her feet with the wall's support. "This cabin shouldn't exist. These symbols shouldn't glow. I shouldn't be able to stand up and have this conversation while in active labor." The rings pulsed brighter, responding to her voice. "But here we are," she continued, "in a place where the normal rules don't apply, where women have been coming for generations when the normal rules failed them, where daughters are born free from the patterns that trapped their mothers." Another contraction swept through her, stronger now, and with it came a flood of clarity that felt like sunlight after years of fog. She could see the threads of manipulation that had bound her to Marcus, the careful isolation from friends and family, the gradual erosion of her sense of reality, but she could also see beyond it, to the life waiting on the other side of this impossible night. "The cabin is choosing," she said, understanding flooding through her as the symbols pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "It brought me here for a reason. My daughter needs to be born here, in this place where transformation is possible." The detective was backing up the ladder now, his face white with confusion and something that might have been terror. "Sir, I think we need to call this in to someone with more experience in unusual circumstances." But Marcus wasn't retreating. His expression had turned calculating, dangerous. "Fine," he said softly. "If you want to have your breakdown in a supernatural setting, that's your choice. But when this is over, when you're exhausted and vulnerable and holding a newborn baby, you'll still need help. You'll still need someone to take care of you." "No," Stephanie said again, and this time the word resonated through the stone, through the rings, through the very air itself. "I won't." The baby kicked once more, and Stephanie smiled despite everything. She was ready to meet her daughter. The detective's boots disappeared up the ladder with hurried, scraping sounds, leaving Stephanie alone with Marcus in the basement's growing supernatural light. She could hear muffled radio chatter from above, the officer trying to call for backup for someone who might understand what he'd witnessed, but the static that answered told her what she already knew. The cabin would allow no interference until her daughter's birth was complete. "Clever," Marcus said, his voice carrying a cold admiration that made her skin crawl. "I have to admit, this is more elaborate than your usual attempts at rebellion. The psychotic episode angle, the supernatural elements, very creative. But you're forgetting something crucial." He stepped closer, and Stephanie felt the familiar pull of his presence, the gravitational force of someone who had spent months reshaping her reality to revolve around his needs. Even now, with power flowing through her from generations of women, part of her wanted to apologize for causing trouble. "I know you," he continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic cadence he'd always used to unravel her defenses. "I know exactly how your mind works, what triggers your guilt, what makes you doubt yourself. You can play pretend with glowing symbols and impossible architecture, but eventually you'll remember who you really are." Another contraction gripped her, stronger now, and Stephanie pressed both palms against the warm stone for support. The baby's movement felt urgent, purposeful. Her daughter was ready to be born, and the cabin was ready to receive her. But Marcus was right about one thing. He did know her weaknesses, knew exactly which words would make her question everything. "You always were too dramatic," his voice whispered in her memory, "always making things more complicated than they need to be. No one else will ever love you the way I do. You're lucky I'm patient enough to deal with your episodes." "Look at yourself," Marcus said now, gesturing at her position against the stone wall. 8 months pregnant, talking to imaginary women, seeing lights that aren't there. When this is over, when the adrenaline crashes and reality reasserts itself, you'll be a new mother with no support system and a documented history of delusional behavior. The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to exploit fears he'd carefully cultivated. But as Stephanie felt the familiar spiral of self-doubt beginning, her daughter kicked again, not distressed but defiant, a tiny fist against the walls that contained her, demanding to be born into a world where truth mattered more than manipulation. "You taught me to doubt myself," Stephanie said slowly, her voice gaining strength as understanding crystallized. "Every time I questioned your version of events, you made me feel crazy. Every time I tried to assert my own needs, you reframed it as selfishness or mental instability." The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, responding to her recognition. She could feel the accumulated wisdom of generations flowing through her, women who had faced similar moments of choice, who had chosen transformation over the familiar prison of learned helplessness. "But I'm not crazy," she continued, rising to her full height as the stone wall reshaped itself to support her. "I'm a highly trained emergency room nurse who saved lives every day until you convinced me I was too unstable to work. I have instincts you spent months teaching me to ignore, strengths you systematically undermined." Marcus's confident expression flickered, uncertainty creeping in around the edges. "Stephanie, you're having pregnancy-induced psychosis. The stress hormones, the sleep deprivation." "No." The word came out with such force that dust fell from the ceiling and the rings embedded in the stone blazed with sudden brilliance. "I'm having clarity. For the first time in months, I'm seeing our relationship without the filter of gaslighting and manipulation." She could see it all now, how he'd isolated her from friends and family, convinced her that her job was too stressful for someone in her condition, gradually eroded every source of confidence and support until she had nowhere to turn except back to him. The pregnancy hadn't been planned or wanted. It had been another chain, another way to ensure she could never leave. "You're not the father," she said, the truth emerging like water from a broken dam. "You never were. The baby is mine alone, conceived before I ever met you, and you've been using my pregnancy as leverage ever since." Marcus's mask finally slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Prove it," he said simply. "When you're holding a screaming newborn in a few hours, when you're bleeding and exhausted and desperate for help, prove to everyone that you're stable enough to care for a child alone." But even as he spoke, Stephanie felt her daughter settling lower, preparing for the final stage of birth. The cabin around them hummed with anticipation, the air itself seeming to shimmer with possibility. She wasn't alone. She had the strength of every woman who had ever chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenience. The final confrontation wasn't coming. It was here. The contraction that seized Stephanie now felt different, deeper, more urgent, carrying with it a power that seemed to flow directly from the stone at her back into her very bones. Her daughter was coming, and with her arrival, everything would change irrevocably. Marcus seemed to sense it too. His calculated composure cracked as the basement filled with an otherworldly luminescence that made his flashlight beam look pale and insignificant. "You think this changes anything?" he said, but his voice had lost its hypnotic authority. "Birth is trauma, Stephanie. Physical trauma, psychological trauma. You'll be vulnerable for weeks, maybe months, and I'll be there, patient and understanding, ready to help you pick up the pieces." The familiar manipulation should have worked. Months of conditioning had taught her to fear her own vulnerability, to see dependence on him as inevitable, but as another contraction built, Stephanie felt something she had almost forgotten, the absolute certainty of her own strength. She was an emergency room nurse who had talked suicidal teenagers off ledges, who had held dying patients' hands through their final moments, who had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. "I've delivered babies in moving ambulances," she said, her voice steady despite the intensity building in her body. "I've performed CPR while hanging upside down in a crashed car. You convinced me I was fragile, but I've never been fragile. I've been controlled. The symbols on the walls responded to her words, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She could feel the presence of every woman who had ever labored in this place, their collective strength flowing through the stone, through the rings, into her very core. They had faced their own moments of transformation, their own final tests, and they had chosen liberation over the familiar safety of chains. Marcus stepped closer, and for a moment his facade dropped completely, revealing the cold fury underneath. "You ungrateful," he started, reaching for her again. But this time, when his fingers should have closed around her wrist, they passed through her skin like she was made of light and air. He stumbled backward, staring at his hand in bewilderment, and Stephanie understood. The cabin wasn't just sanctuary. It was a place where truth became tangible, where the lies that bound women to their captors simply ceased to function. "The baby isn't yours," she said, each word settling into reality with the weight of natural law. "The relationship you're describing never existed, and you have no power here." Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before, and she welcomed it completely. Her daughter was ready to be born into a world where truth mattered more than manipulation, where women's voices carried the authority of lived experience. The vanilla and honey scent grew overwhelming, joined by something clean and sharp, the smell of snow-covered pine trees, and infinite possibility. Above them, she could hear the detective's increasingly frantic radio calls, his voice cracking as he tried to explain to his dispatcher that he'd found the missing woman but needed someone who understood unusual circumstances. The static that answered confirmed what Stephanie already knew. The normal rules of evidence and jurisdiction had no meaning here. This was a place outside ordinary time and space, where transformation happened according to its own ancient logic. "When this is over," Marcus said desperately, backing toward the ladder, "when you're sleep-deprived and hormonal and dealing with postpartum depression, you'll remember why you need me. You'll remember that I'm the only one who understands your episodes, who has the patience to help you manage your mental health." But even as he spoke, Stephanie could see the future he was describing dissolving like mist. She wouldn't be returning to the life he'd constructed for her, wouldn't be grateful for his version of love that felt like drowning. Her daughter would grow up free from the patterns that had trapped her mother, would learn from birth that her voice mattered, that her needs were valid, that love didn't require the surrender of self. The pressure in her body built to an impossible crescendo, and Stephanie felt her daughter's presence like a bright flame preparing to enter the world. The stone wall behind her grew warm, reshaping itself into something that felt like an embrace, and she understood that this was what the cabin had been waiting for, not just another woman seeking refuge, but a mother ready to break generational patterns of surrender and submission. "She's coming," Stephanie breathed, and the words carried absolute certainty. Around them, the basement hummed with anticipation, every symbol blazing with light that seemed to emanate from some source beyond the visible spectrum. The rings embedded in the stone pulsed in perfect synchronization with her heartbeat, with her daughter's heartbeat, with the rhythm of transformation itself. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to make one final attempt at reasserting control, but the sound that emerged was lost beneath something far more powerful, the first cry of a daughter being born into freedom, in a place where the impossible had always been possible, where women had been rewriting the rules for generations. The final test wasn't just beginning, it was complete. The baby's cry pierced the supernatural stillness like a blade cutting through centuries of accumulated silence. But as the sound faded, Stephanie realized with growing horror that her daughter hadn't been born yet. The cry had come from somewhere else entirely, echoing through the stone walls like a memory-given voice. Marcus's face went white. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his certainty was cracking like ice under spring thaw. "You're not even in active labor yet. The baby can't—" "She's been waiting," Stephanie said, understanding flooding through her as another crushing contraction seized her body. "All of them have been waiting." The rings embedded in the stone began to spin, faster and faster, until they became circles of pure light. The temperature in the basement dropped suddenly, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and Stephanie could see them now. Dozens of women standing in the spaces between moments, between heartbeats, between the possible and the real. Some wore pioneer dresses, their hands stained with soil and blood. Others had the practical uniforms of wartime nurses, their eyes hollow with knowledge of what men could do to each other. Modern women in business suits stood beside teenage girls in torn prom dresses, their shared trauma creating a tapestry of survival that stretched back generations. All of them had come to this place in their darkest hour. All of them had given birth to daughters who would rewrite the rules. "The pattern ends here," said a voice that might have been Mary Elizabeth's, or the ghostly girl's, or Stephanie's own voice echoing back from some impossible future. "Tonight." Marcus stumbled backward until his spine hit the ladder, his carefully constructed reality crumbling as the women pressed closer. They weren't threatening, they were witnessing, bearing silent testimony to every lie he'd told, every manipulation he'd deployed, every moment he'd convinced Stephanie that her own perceptions were flawed. "You made me believe I was crazy," Stephanie said, her voice carrying across dimensions as another contraction built. "You isolated me from everyone who might have contradicted your version of events. You convinced me that pregnancy had made me unstable, that I needed your protection from my own mind." "I was protecting you," Marcus protested, but his words fell flat in the presence of so much accumulated truth. "You were having episodes, making irrational decisions." "I was trying to leave," Stephanie interrupted, and the ghostly women nodded in unison. "Every instinct I had was telling me to run, and you systematically destroyed my trust in those instincts. You made me dependent on your interpretation of reality." The contraction peaked, and with it came a clarity so absolute it felt like being struck by lightning. She could see the entire architecture of his manipulation, how he'd moved into her life during a vulnerable period after her father's death, how he'd gradually isolated her from friends and colleagues, how he'd reframed her pregnancy as evidence of mental instability rather than the result of a brief relationship she'd ended before meeting him. "The baby isn't yours," she said again, and this time the words carried the weight of absolute truth. "You've known from the beginning. You saw a pregnant woman in crisis and recognized an opportunity for control." Marcus's face twisted with rage and desperation. "Prove it," he snarled. "In a few hours, when you're holding a screaming infant and bleeding and exhausted, prove to the world that you're stable enough to care for a child alone. Prove that this isn't all an elaborate delusion brought on by pregnancy psychosis." But even as he spoke, Stephanie felt her daughter moving differently inside her, not distressed but purposeful, getting into position for the final descent. Around them, the ghostly women began to hum, a low sound that resonated through the stone and into Stephanie's bones. It was a birthing song, she realized, passed down through generations of women who had labored in this place. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Stephanie said, her voice joining the ancient harmony. "Not anymore." The basement filled with blinding light as every symbol, every ring, every carved surface blazed with accumulated power. Marcus screamed, covering his eyes, but the light didn't hurt Stephanie at all. It felt like being embraced by the sun itself, like being welcomed home after a long journey through darkness. When her vision cleared, Marcus was gone. Not fled, simply absent, as if the cabin had decided his presence was incompatible with what needed to happen next. Only the detective remained, clinging to the ladder's upper rungs with white knuckles, his radio crackling with static that almost sounded like voices offering encouragement. "Ma'am," he called down shakily, I think I should call for an ambulance." "No," Stephanie said gently, settling back against the stone wall as it reshaped itself into the perfect birthing chair. "This is exactly where she needs to be born." The next contraction came like a tide, carrying with it the weight of transformation itself. Her daughter was ready to enter the world, and the cabin was ready to receive her. The confrontation was over. The birth was beginning. The contraction that seized Stephanie now felt different from all the others, not just the physical pressure of birth, but the weight of choice itself. As her daughter moved into position, Stephanie understood with crystalline clarity what victory would cost. The ghostly women surrounding her hummed their ancient birthing song, but their eyes held a sorrow that cut through her euphoria like a blade. "Every daughter born in this place carries the gift," whispered a voice that might have been Mary Elizabeth's. "The ability to see truth, to bend reality, to break the chains that bind women to their captors. But the gift comes with a price." Another contraction built, and with it came visions, flashes of possible futures spreading out like branches of a vast tree. She saw her daughter growing up strong and unafraid, never doubting her own perceptions, never allowing anyone to gaslight her into submission. But she also saw the isolation that would come with such clarity, the loneliness of seeing through every pretty lie that made ordinary life bearable. "What price?" Stephanie gasped, though part of her already knew. The stone wall behind her grew warm, almost liquid, reshaping itself to cradle her perfectly as the final stage of labor began. The symbols carved into every surface pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she could feel the cabin itself holding its breath in anticipation. "The mothers cannot stay," said another voice, older and infinitely sad. "We give our daughters the gift of sight, of strength, of freedom from the patterns that trapped us. But we cannot walk in both worlds. We cannot be ordinary mothers living ordinary lives." Stephanie's hands flew to her belly as understanding crashed over her. "No," she whispered, "there has to be another way." But even as she spoke, she felt herself becoming lighter, more translucent. The detective's worried shouts from above seemed to be coming from very far away, as if she were sinking deeper into the earth with each contraction. The vanilla and honey scent grew overwhelming, joined by something else, the smell of old paper and dried flowers, the scent of things preserved beyond their natural time. "Your daughter will be found," the ghostly women promised. "She will be raised by good people who will never know her true nature until she's old enough to understand it herself. She will grow up free from the trauma that shaped you, free from the fear that drove you to this place." "But I'll never hold her," Stephanie said, tears streaming down her face as the final contraction began. "I'll never sing her to sleep or kiss her scraped knees or see her first steps." "You'll give her something more precious," Mary Elizabeth's voice whispered. "You'll give her the certainty that she matters, that her voice has power, that no one can ever convince her she's less than she is. The gift passes through pain, through sacrifice, through mothers who love their daughters enough to set them free." The pressure built to an impossible crescendo, and Stephanie felt her daughter crowning, not just into the physical world, but into a reality where women's strength wasn't theoretical but tangible, where truth had the power to reshape the very foundations of existence. The rings in the stone spun faster, creating a vortex of light that seemed to draw the very essence of who she was upward and outward. "She'll know," Stephanie said, her voice growing fainter even as it carried absolute conviction. "Somehow, she'll know that her mother loved her enough to give her everything." With a final surge that felt like her soul being torn from her body, her daughter entered the world. The baby's cry was perfect, healthy and strong and absolutely furious at being born into such strangeness. But as Stephanie reached out to hold her child, her hands passed through the tiny form like smoke through sunlight. The detective's footsteps thundered down the ladder now, his radio crackling with urgent calls for medical assistance. He would find the baby wrapped in his own jacket, impossibly clean and warm despite being born in a basement. The DNA tests would show no father on record, no family to claim her. She would be adopted by a loving couple who would name her Hope and never quite understand why she seemed to see things other children missed. Stephanie felt herself fading, becoming one with the stone walls and carved symbols and accumulated wisdom of all the women who had made the same choice. She was joining something larger than individual existence, becoming part of the force that would guide and protect daughters like hers for generations to come. "The pattern is broken," she whispered, her voice now indistinguishable from the wind through pine trees, from the settling of ancient wood, from the whispered prayers of women who had chosen their children's freedom over their own lives. Above, her daughter's cries grew stronger, more insistent. Soon the detective would carry her up into the world of ordinary light and ordinary time, where she would grow up knowing in her bones that she was precious, that her perceptions mattered, that no one could ever convince her she was less than whole. The sacrifice was complete. Victory had come at the price of everything. The basement fell silent, except for the baby's cries and the detective's ragged breathing as he reached the bottom of the ladder. His flashlight beam swept across the space, illuminating carved symbols that were already beginning to fade, their supernatural glow dimming to ordinary stone. Where moments before dozens of ghostly women had stood witness, now there was only empty air and the lingering scent of vanilla and honey. "Jesus Christ!" Detective Morrison whispered, his hands shaking as he approached the tiny form wrapped in his own jacket. The baby was impossibly clean for having just been born, her skin pink and perfect, her dark hair already dry. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone who had entered the world mere minutes ago. He'd seen 3 decades of crime scenes, had delivered testimony that sent killers to death row, but nothing had prepared him for this. His radio crackled with static as dispatch tried to reach him, the signals fragmenting in the electromagnetic disturbance that still surrounded the cabin like invisible fog. "This is Morrison," he managed, lifting the baby carefully as her cries softened to curious whimpers. I need medical assistance at the Chen location. We have an infant in need of immediate evaluation." The voice that responded seemed to come from very far away, distorted by interference that made no technical sense. Morrison looked around the basement one final time, searching for any trace of the pregnant woman he'd followed down here. But Stephanie Chen was gone as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving only the impossible evidence of her sacrifice. As he climbed toward the main floor, the baby nestled against his chest with surprising contentment. She wasn't crying anymore, just studying his face with those unsettling dark eyes. Morrison had kids of his own, 3 daughters who had filled his house with chaos and laughter for years, but he'd never seen an infant this alert, this present. The storm outside was breaking as he emerged from the cabin, rain still falling but with less fury. His patrol car looked exactly as he'd left it, but something felt different about the world itself, as if reality had been subtly recalibrated while he was underground. The cabin behind him appeared ordinary now, just an old hunting lodge that had seen better days, nothing supernatural about it at all. Morrison's radio finally cleared as he reached his vehicle. "Detective, what's your status? We've got multiple agencies asking about the Chen woman." He looked down at the baby, who was watching raindrops streak across the windshield with what looked like fascination rather than fear. How could he explain what he'd witnessed? How could he tell dispatch that he'd found an infant born from sacrifice and magic, that the missing woman had dissolved into light and stone to save a daughter she'd never hold? "Stephanie Chen is not at this location," he said carefully, "because it was technically true, but I have recovered an infant in apparent good health. I need Child Protective Services and a medical team at Mercy General." The questions that followed blurred together as Morrison drove through the breaking storm. The baby slept peacefully despite the radio chatter and siren sounds, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. She would need a name for the paperwork, would need placement with a family while the system tried to untangle her origins. But Morrison already knew the DNA tests would come back inconclusive. The father Stephanie had mentioned, Marcus, would be nowhere to be found, as if he'd simply vanished from all records. There would be no family to claim this child, no relatives stepping forward with custody demands. She would become a ward of the state, available for adoption by whatever family could see past the questions surrounding her arrival. At Mercy General, Dr. Sarah Kim examined the infant with increasing amazement. "This baby is perfect," she told Morrison, running through test after test that all came back normal. Full term, healthy weight, no complications from what must have been an unassisted birth. "It's remarkable." What was more remarkable, though Dr. Kim didn't mention it in her official report, was the way the infant seemed to track movement in empty corners of the room, as if she could see things that weren't visible to adult eyes. The way she settled immediately when held by female staff, but grew fussy in the arms of certain men. The way she seemed to study faces with an intensity that was both endearing and slightly unnerving. 3 weeks later, David and Maria Santos received the call they'd been waiting for after 2 years on the adoption list. The social worker was apologetic about the unusual circumstances, but the baby needed placement and they'd been thoroughly vetted. "She's special," the caseworker said, though she couldn't quite articulate why. "The family that takes her needs to understand that." The Santos family understood perfectly. They had been trying to conceive for 8 years, had lost 2 pregnancies to miscarriage, and had learned to recognize miracles when they appeared. When they held the baby for the first time, she looked at them with those knowing dark eyes and seemed to smile. They named her Hope, never knowing how perfectly the choice honored her mother's final gift. 5 years later, Detective Morrison found himself driving the same mountain road where everything had changed. It wasn't duty that brought him back. The case file on Stephanie Chen remained officially open, but inactive. Her disappearance categorized as a missing person who had likely fled domestic violence. No one questioned his report about finding an abandoned infant. These things happened more often than the public realized. But Morrison knew better. He knew what he'd witnessed in that basement, what he'd carried up from the depths of something far older than law enforcement could comprehend. The knowledge had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He found himself more attuned to the spaces between words when interviewing suspects, more sensitive to the particular quality of fear in women's voices when they called about domestic disturbances. His solve rate for cases involving violence against women had improved dramatically, though he couldn't explain to his captain why he seemed to know exactly which questions to ask. The cabin looked different in daylight, weathered but somehow peaceful. Morrison parked in the same spot where his patrol car had sat during that terrible storm and walked the perimeter slowly. The basement entrance was sealed now. The county had declared the structure unsafe after his report mentioned unstable flooring, but he could still feel the pull of whatever force had resided below, dormant now but not entirely gone. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Sarah, now 16 and sharp as her mother had ever been. "Dad, that thing you said about trusting my instincts, I think I finally get it. Some things you just know, right?" Morrison smiled, remembering the conversation they'd had after she'd refused a ride home from a boyfriend who'd been drinking. She couldn't explain why she'd felt unsafe, just that something in her gut had screamed warnings. He'd told her that feeling was more valuable than logic sometimes, that women who learned to trust those instincts lived longer and safer lives. "That's exactly right," he texted back. "Never ignore that voice." 20 minutes down the mountain, Morrison pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Elementary. He'd made this trip every year for the past 3, always finding an excuse. A community safety presentation, a career day talk, anything that let him check on Hope Santos without arousing suspicion. Through the playground fence, he spotted her immediately. At 5, she was tall for her age, with dark hair that caught light like her birth mother's and those same knowing eyes that seemed to see everything. She was playing alone, but not in a way that suggested loneliness. She appeared to be having an animated conversation with empty air, gesturing and laughing as if responding to invisible friends. "Detective Morrison?" Maria Santos approached from the school entrance, her face lighting with genuine warmth. What a lovely surprise. "Are you here for another safety talk?" "Actually, I was hoping to catch up with you and David," Morrison said, watching Hope from the corner of his eye. "See how Hope's adjusting?" Maria's expression grew complex, pride mixed with puzzlement. "She's remarkable. The teachers say they've never seen a child so intuitive about other people's feelings. Last week she told her kindergarten teacher that Mr. Peterson made her feel wrong inside, and it turned out he'd been reprimanded at his previous school for inappropriate behavior with students. We had no way of knowing that when we enrolled her." Morrison nodded, unsurprised. Kids pick up on things adults miss. It's more than that, though. Maria lowered her voice. Sometimes I catch her talking to people who aren't there. When I ask who she's chatting with, she just says the mothers. She describes them in detail, women in old-fashioned dresses, nurses from long ago. David thinks it's just an active imagination, but you know better, Morrison finished gently. Maria studied his face. You know something about where she came from, don't you? Something more than what's in the official report. Before Morrison could respond, Hope abandoned her invisible companions and ran toward the fence. "Hi, Mr. Morrison," she called out, her voice bright with genuine affection. "The mothers said you might come today. They want you to know they're proud of you." Morrison felt his throat tighten. "Are they here now, sweetheart?" Hope nodded seriously, pointing to empty spaces around the playground. "They watch sometimes. They make sure I'm safe and that I remember important things, like how I'm supposed to help other kids who feel scared, and how my real mommy loved me so much she became one of the mothers so I could be strong." Maria's hand flew to her mouth, tears beginning to form. This wasn't the first time Hope had mentioned her real mommy with such matter-of-fact acceptance, but hearing it described this way cut straight to the heart of what they'd all been dancing around. "Hope," Morrison said carefully, "do the mothers ever tell you anything else about your real mommy?" Hope tilted her head, considering. "They say she's not gone. She's just different now, and that someday when I'm old enough to help other people the way she helped me, I'll understand everything." She pressed her small hand against the fence, and Morrison covered it with his own. For just a moment he could swear he felt something else, a warmth that wasn't quite human, a presence that carried the scent of vanilla and honey. "Tell her thank you," he whispered. Hope smiled. She already knows. The years flowed like a gentle river after that moment at the playground fence. Morrison continued his visits, watching Hope grow from a precocious 5-year-old into a confident teenager who moved through the world with an unusual combination of compassion and strength. The invisible mothers still whispered to her sometimes, though less frequently as she matured, their guidance becoming more subtle. A feeling rather than voices, an intuition rather than conversation. Maria and David Santos had long since stopped questioning the miraculous nature of their daughter's arrival in their lives. Hope's ability to sense danger, to comfort frightened classmates, to somehow know when adults weren't trustworthy, had proven itself too many times to dismiss. They learned to trust her instincts as much as she did, creating a household where the extraordinary was simply part of their ordinary love. On Hope's 16th birthday, Morrison made his usual visit to find her alone in the backyard, staring up at clouds that seemed to shift into meaningful patterns. She was nearly as tall as her adoptive mother now, with the same dark eyes that had studied him as an infant. But there was something different about her presence, a settled quality, as if she'd finally grown into the fullness of who she was meant to become. "They're really gone now, aren't they?" Morrison asked, settling into the lawn chair beside her. Hope nodded without surprise at his appearance. "This morning, the mothers said their job was finished." She turned to face him, and Morrison saw Stephanie Chen's determined expression looking back at him. "They told me it was time to start my real work, which is helping other girls learn to trust themselves, teaching them that their feelings matter, that they don't have to accept what hurts them just because someone says they should." Hope's voice carried a certainty that reminded Morrison of her birth mother's final moments. "There are so many who need to hear it." Maria emerged from the house with a birthday cake, her face radiant with the particular joy of a woman who had been given exactly the daughter she never knew she needed. David followed with a camera, ready to capture another moment in their unexpected family story. As they sang Happy Birthday, Morrison found himself thinking about patterns, not the cursed ones that Stephanie had broken, but the healing ones that Hope was creating. The cycle of fear and silence that had plagued generations of women in her bloodline had been replaced with something entirely different, a legacy of strength that grew stronger with each person it touched. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Maria encouraged as Hope leaned over the candles. Morrison watched her close her eyes, her face peaceful in the golden light. When she blew out the flames, he could have sworn he felt a gentle breeze that carried the scent of vanilla and honey, a mother's blessing from beyond the veil of ordinary reality. Later, as the Santos family cleaned up the celebration, Hope pulled Morrison aside. "She wants you to know," she said quietly, "that she's proud of how you've changed, the way you listen to women now, really listen, the way you've saved others by believing their stories." Morrison's eyes filled with unexpected tears. 30-year veterans of the police force weren't supposed to cry at birthday parties, but some transformations demanded acknowledgement. "I just follow the evidence," he managed. "Evidence of the heart," Hope agreed. "That's the most important kind." As Morrison drove away that evening, he realized that the story which had begun with terror and sacrifice had become something beautiful. Stephanie Chen's daughter was exactly who she was meant to be, a young woman who would never doubt her own worth, who would help others find their voices, who carried within her the accumulated strength of all the mothers who had chosen freedom over fear. The cabin in the mountains stood empty now, truly abandoned. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was full, drivers on that winding road reported seeing warm light in the windows and catching the scent of vanilla and honey on the wind. They would slow down, feeling an inexplicable sense of comfort, of being watched over by something benevolent and strong. Hope Santos was 16, and she was just beginning to understand the gift her mother had given her. Not just life, but the certainty that she mattered. Not just safety, but the power to create safety for others. Not just love, but the kind of love that transforms reality itself. In the end, Stephanie had won completely. The pattern was broken, the curse transformed into blessing, and her daughter walked free in a world where women's strength was no longer theoretical but proven, no longer whispered but proclaimed. Some sacrifices echo through generations. The best ones become songs of victory that never end.